This is Brother Peter Diamond, vaticancatholic.com. This is part 5 of the discussion of John Salza's errors on Sedevacantism. At the end of the last part, I was explaining how in his article against Sedevacantism, which is called The Errors of Sedevacantism and Ecclesiastical Law, he blatantly contradicts himself on a central issue. At the beginning of his article, he admits that the Sedevacantists are correct when they say that a heretic would lose his office without any declaration. He says that this is the teaching of the divine law and canon law, canon 188.4. So he admits if someone is in fact a heretic, he cannot have an office in the church. However, later on in his article, he directly contradicts himself when discussing canon 2264, because he argues that according to that canon, even if someone is a heretic, he would retain jurisdiction over the universal church. Since such jurisdiction, that is, ordinary jurisdiction, is attached to an office, by arguing that the person who is a heretic retains the jurisdiction over the universal church, he is saying that he retains the office. Hence, he directly contradicts himself on a central issue, and that proves that he does not understand what he's talking about, that his position is completely false, and that he will just throw anything out there hoping that it sticks. Now, I want to quickly refute what he says in the second half of his article about canon 2264, even though the first half of his article refutes it. He says that according to this canon, an excommunicated heretic would retain his jurisdiction over the universal church. And this is completely wrong, simply because the canon is not dealing with loss of office, but rather with the fact that Catholics may receive certain sacraments from excommunicated persons. If you look at the subject heading above canon 188.4, which teaches that those who publicly defect from the faith, that is, heretics, lose offices, you can see that that comes within a section dedicated to loss of office. So if we want to find out what it says about loss of office, we would look at canon 188.4, which teaches that heretics cannot retain offices. But he misapplies this canon, which is not dealing with loss of office but something else, and applies it to loss of office. That's why he makes such a big mistake and contradicts himself. What is the canon talking about? The canon is talking about the fact that an excommunicated individual, and it's not only dealing with heretics, it could be dealing with people who are excommunicated in a more minor fashion but who are still members of the church. It's saying that they can perform certain acts of jurisdiction with validity, not that they retain offices in the church. For example, suppose a bishop is a heretic and has excommunicated himself and thus lost his office, but a Catholic is unaware of this and approaches the bishop for confession, and the bishop hears the confession and gives absolution. The church can supply the jurisdiction to that heretical bishop for the absolution. Therefore, that heretical bishop who is excommunicated can perform that act of jurisdiction with validity, but he does not retain his office in the church. That's the crucial distinction that Salza is unaware of or ignores, and that's why he falls into such an error and such a blatant contradiction. That's what canon 2264 is talking about, and that's further proven by the fact that the canon itself comes within the context of canons dealing with this topic, and it makes reference to canon 2261 two times. Canon 2261, if you read it, deals with the faithful approaching excommunicated persons for certain sacraments or sacramentals. Exactly what I'm talking about. That yes, they can administer certain sacraments, for example, confession, and thus the jurisdiction is given to him for that act, not retaining offices. So he completely took it out of context, misapplied it, and in the process contradicted himself. And I explained more about that in my article. So, we've shown that he directly contradicts himself on principle number 1, a central issue, and he completely misunderstands and misapplies this canon. But there's something even more revealing. Remember how at the beginning of this discussion I explained how Salza draws this key distinction between principle number 1, the fact that heretics lose their offices in the church, and principle number 2, how we can know that. He claimed to admit, number one, that heretics do lose their offices, but said we need a declaration from the Church to know number two. We already showed that he contradicted himself on number one. Now I'm going to show that he contradicts himself on number two. Because in his discussion of Canon 2264, he argues that this canon means that self-excommunicated heretics retain jurisdiction in the Church. We just refuted that. But when he makes that argument, he falls into this second massive contradiction. Here's why. Canon 2264, as I said earlier, makes reference to Canon 2261. And in Canon 2261, points 2 and 3, it says this in point 2. The faithful may, for any just cause, seek the sacraments and sacramentals from one excommunicated, especially if other ministers are lacking. But from a banned excommunicate, and from others excommunicated after a condemnatory or declaratory sentence has come, only the faithful in danger of death may ask for sacramental absolution. End quote. So Canon 2261 says that the faithful may approach for the sacrament someone who is excommunicated, but someone who has been declared they can only approach in danger of death. What does that presuppose? That, of course, presupposes that the faithful can distinguish between someone who is excommunicated by a declared sentence and someone who has been ipso facto excommunicated. Since Salza includes self-excommunicated heretics within the category of individuals under discussion in this canon and the related Canon 2264, that means that he unwittingly, that is, without realizing it, proves our point that Catholics can recognize on their own that some people are excommunicated heretics, but have not yet been declared excommunicated. And that contradicts his principle number 2, because he argued that we need a declaration from the Church to know if someone has been self-excommunicated for heresy. We have thus caught him in a second massive contradiction, and a contradiction on his principle number 2. If we apply his own reasoning, we can show that a Catholic without any declaration from the Church can recognize someone as excommunicated and as a heretic before he has been declared to be an excommunicated heretic. So, he's contradicted himself on the two central issues. He's contradicted himself on number 1, whether heretics lose their offices without any declaration. And he's contradicted himself on number 2, his argument that we cannot recognize someone as an excommunicated heretic until the Church tells us. This is not even to repeat all of the points we covered earlier from Pope Paul IV, etc., which prove that Salza is completely wrong. It is rather to focus on his own statements which prove that he's wrong. In other words, how he contradicts himself.